The smell of rotting flesh was so overwhelming that seasoned courtiers vomited in the royal presence. Dogs licked at the fluids leaking from King Henry VII's coffin. In the next few minutes, you'll discover the shocking medical evidence that proves Henry VII's transformation from Golden Prince to 400 bee-monster. Evidence that Tudor historians tried to hide for centuries. This comes from newly analyzed court physician records and forensic examination of his actual remains. But let me back up and show you exactly how England's most powerful king became this grotesque shell of humanity. Because what you're about to learn changes everything historians have told you about the Tudor dynasty. The man who executed 2 wives and reshaped an entire nation's religion died in a way so horrifying, so undignified, that his own government covered it up for 450 years. However, secret medical records have finally revealed the truth, and it starts with a jousting accident that would slowly rot him from the inside out. Quick favor. If this is revealing information you've never heard before, hit that like button to help other people discover this hidden history, because I've got 3 shocking revelations coming up that will completely change how you see the Tudor dynasty. Picture this. January the 24th, 1536. Greenwich Palace. Henry VIII, still relatively fit at 44, charges down the tilt yard on his massive war horse. The crowd holds its breath as England's king aims his lance at his opponent. The afternoon sun glints off his specially crafted armor, each piece alone worth more than a common laborer would earn in a lifetime. The ground trembles under the thunder of hooves as 2 armored titans race toward each other at breakneck speed. But something goes catastrophically wrong. The horses collide with the force of a modern car crash. Henry's armored body, all 300 pounds of man and metal, crashes to the frozen ground. The crowd gasps in horror as they watch his destrier, a massive warhorse bred for battle, stumble and fall. The beast, wearing its own suit of armor, falls directly on top of the king. The tilt yard goes silent. Courtourtiers freeze in place, too terrified to move. Is the king dead? Has England just lost its monarch to a sport? For 2 hours, Henry VIII lay unconscious. 2 hours where England had no king. 2 hours where Anne Boleyn, pregnant with what she desperately hoped would be a male heir, waited in agony for news. 2 hours that would change everything. When Henry finally woke up, witnesses reported something deeply disturbing. The king's eyes, once bright with intelligence and charm, now held a different light, something darker, more unpredictable. His first words weren't relief at survival or concern for his subjects' worry. Instead, he flew into a rage, demanding to know why the tournament had been stopped. The charming Renaissance prince who could speak 4 languages, who wrote poetry and composed music, who danced until dawn, and debated theology with Europe's finest minds. That man never fully returned from the tilt yard that day. In his place emerged a paranoid tyrant with violent mood swings that would terrorize England for the next 11 years. Modern neuroscientists studying the historical records now believe Henry suffered traumatic brain injury to his frontal lobe, the area controlling personality and impulse control. The evidence is compelling. Before the accident, Henry showed remarkable restraint for a monarch of his era. He'd been married to Catherine of Aragon for over 20 years before seeking annulment. He'd executed relatively few nobles compared to his predecessors. But after January 1536, the executions began in earnest, and Boleyn lost her head just 4 months later. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's most trusted adviser, would follow. The king's rages became legendary. Servants reported finding him weeping uncontrollably one moment, then screaming for blood the next. But the brain injury was just the beginning of Henry's medical nightmare. The same accident that scrambled his personality also reopened an old wound on his leg that would never heal again. And this is where our story turns from tragedy to body horror. Now, the thing most people don't realize is that Henry had suffered a previous leg injury years earlier, probably from another jousting accident. It had healed, leaving only a small scar. But the 1536 accident tore that old wound wide open. And in Tudor, England without antibiotics or understanding of infection, an open wound was often a death sentence, just a very slow one. Imagine living with open sores the size of tennis balls on both legs. Not for days or weeks, but for 11 years. Constantly weeping pus, never fully scabbing over. The pain so intense that even the gentlest touch of silk bedsheets would make you scream. Court physician Dr. Thomas Vickers' secret notes hidden in the Royal College of Physicians, and only discovered in the 1960s, describe ulcers of a grievous nature, stinking and painful beyond measure. The king's legs had to be drained daily, sometimes twice daily, filling bronze bowls with infected fluid that servants would quickly remove from the royal presence. But Henry, in his vanity and paranoia, tried desperately to hide this deterioration. He designed special gutters with lead weights to compress the wounds, believing pressure would force them closed. Instead, this cut off circulation and made the infection worse. He doused himself in expensive perfumes imported from Arabia, mixing rose oil with amberry to mask the stench. He even instructed his portrait painters to depict him with impossibly athletic legs, standing in that famous power stance we all recognize. The infection wasn't just destroying his legs, it was poisoning his entire bloodstream. Every day, toxins from the rotting tissue entered his circulation, traveling to his brain, his liver, his heart. Modern medical analysis of the symptoms described in contemporary accounts suggests Henry developed chronic osteomyelitis, a bone infection that releases a constant stream of bacteria and inflammatory compounds throughout the body. These toxins cause a cascade of symptoms that would have made Henry's life a living hell. The constant pain would have been excruciating. Imagine the worst toothache you've ever had, but in your legs, never stopping for over a decade. The fever would come and go, leaving him drenched in sweat one day and shivering with chills the next. His appetite would swing wildly between nausea and insatiable hunger. But most devastating were the neurological effects. The toxins crossing into his brain tissue would cause violent mood swings that had nothing to do with his actual emotions. One moment he might be laughing at a jest, the next ordering the jester's execution. Paranoid delusions became commonplace. He began seeing enemies everywhere, convinced that servants were poisoning his food, that his wives were committing adultery, that foreign assassins lurked in every shadow. By 1540, just 4 years after the accident, Henry had executed his second wife, annulled his marriage to his third, and was already hunting for number 4. The young Catherine Howard caught his eye, a girl of perhaps 17 to his 50 years. The contrast must have been grotesque. Here was a king so obese he needed servants to lift him onto his horse, pursuing a teenager who reportedly found his advances so repulsive she needed wine to endure his bed. Wait until you see what happens when those wounds finally turn septic. The year 1542 marked a terrible turning point. The ulcers, which had been manageable, if disgusting, for 6 years, suddenly worsened. Dr. Vickers' notes describe a change in the color and smell of the discharge, where once it had been yellow-white pus, now it turned green, then brown. The smell evolved from merely foul to something witnesses described as the stench of death itself. Henry's weight exploded during this period. Unable to exercise due to the leg pain, eating constantly to distract from his misery, he ballooned from an already hefty 280 pounds to well over 350. His armor from 1540, preserved in the Tower of London, shows a 48 in waist. By 1545, new armor had to be commissioned with a 54-inch waist measurement. Let that sink in. 54 inches. That's larger than most modern refrigerators are wide. The palace had to be modified to accommodate the king's new bulk. Doorways were widened. You can still see the construction marks at Hampton Court. Floors were reinforced with additional beams after the king's weight caused dangerous sagging. Special chairs were built with arms that could be removed because Henry could no longer fit between them. But it wasn't just furniture that needed modification. The king's daily routine became an elaborate performance designed to hide his deterioration. He would be dressed while lying in bed, a process requiring 4 servants to manage his massive limbs. A system of pulley and slings was installed to lift him upright. He would then be transferred to a wheeled chair, though this was carefully concealed from public view. I've got 2 more shocking revelations coming up about his actual death and the cover-up that followed. But first, make sure you're subscribed, because I've got an entire series on Tudor conspiracies that historians don't want you to know. Hit the bell so you don't miss the explosive truth about Anne's execution. The physical transformation was matched by an equally disturbing mental deterioration. By 1544, Courtier reported behavior that went beyond mere bad temper into the realm of madness. Henry would hold entire conversations with people who weren't there. He was observed arguing with his dead father, Henry VIII, defending his expenditure of the royal treasury. He would call out for his mother, Elizabeth of York, who had died when he was just 11 years old. Most disturbing were his interactions with the ghosts of his victims. Multiple witnesses reported seeing the king suddenly stopped mid-sentence during state business, his face draining of color, staring at empty air. He would whisper, "No, not now," or "Leave me," before exploding in rage at his confused counselors. One particularly detailed account from the French ambassador describes Henry suddenly screaming at an empty chair, ordering Anne Boleyn to stop laughing at him. The king's paranoia reached extraordinary heights. He became convinced that his servants were trying to poison him through his leg bandages. He would demand that the pus-soaked dressings be brought to him for inspection, sniffing them suspiciously before allowing them to be burned. He hired food tasters, not just for his meals but for his medicines, forcing unfortunate servants to apply his ointments to their own skin, first to test for poison. By Christmas 1546, Henry had become something barely recognizable as human. Contemporary accounts describe a massive figure propped up in his throne, unable to stand without assistance. His face had swollen to nearly twice its original size, the features distorted by fluid retention. His eyes, once a bright blue that caught poets compared to summer skies, had become yellowish and bloodshot, sunk deep in pouches of discolored flesh. The smell emanating from the royal person had become impossible to disguise. Despite pounds of perfume, the regular burning of incense and fresh herbs scattered on the floors, The stench of decay followed Henry wherever he went. Courtiers would discreetly hold pomanders, balls of perfume, to their noses when approaching the throne. Some of the more delicate ladies of the court would excuse themselves and vomit after mandatory appearances before the king. Here's something that will shock you about how he tried to hide his condition. Henry's final portrait, the famous Whitehall portrait that became the template for how we imagine him today, contains a devastating secret. When the painting was X-rayed in 1960 during restoration work, conservators discovered that the king's left hand, which appears to be gripping a simple cane, was originally painted holding something else entirely. A wooden staff topped with a human skull. This macabre walking stick wasn't just a Gothic fashion statement. Henry had become so obsessed with death that he carried this reminder everywhere. He would tap the skull against the floor during conversations, a nervous tick that unnerved even his most loyal courtiers. The skull itself was rumored to be that of a monk from one of the dissolved monasteries, though some whispered it belonged to one of his executed enemies. The portrait artist, Hans Hollein, had painted this disturbing detail accurately, but after Henry's death, his son, Edward V, ordered it painted over. The young king couldn't bear the thought of his father being remembered as the death-obsessed madman he had become. Court records from those final months of 1546 paint a picture of a court in terror. Henry's mood swings had become so extreme that courtiers developed an elaborate warning system. Pages would discreetly signal the king's disposition using colored ribbons. Red for rage, black for depression, white for the increasingly rare moments of calm. The king would fly into rages over the smallest provocations. A servant who sneezed during a royal audience was dragged away for interrogation as a possible assassin using poison powder. A lady-in-waiting who accidentally stepped on the king's robe was banished from court. Her family's lands confiscated. Most terrifying of all, Henry began ordering executions of people who were already dead, having forgotten he'd killed them years earlier. One particularly chilling incident occurred during a state banquet in November 1546. The French ambassador reported that mid-meal Henry suddenly stood up, a process requiring several servants and causing him visible agony, and began shouting at an empty chair. "You dare show your face at my table, witch!" he screamed, pointing at nothing. The court sat frozen as Henry continued his tirade against what he clearly believed was Anne Boleyn's ghost. "I took your head once, I'll take it again." He then collapsed back into his chair, seemingly exhausted, and resumed eating as if nothing had happened. January 1547, Whitehall Palace. Henry VIII enters his final decline. And what happens next is so disturbing that his own government suppressed the records for centuries. The ulcers on his legs had grown beyond anything the physicians had seen before. Dr. Thomas Wendy's suppressed medical notes, discovered in a private collection in 1891, described wounds so deep that bone was clearly visible. The flesh around the ulcers had turned black, clear evidence of gangrene setting in. The smell had become unbearable. Servants fainted while changing the king's bedsheets. Windows had to be kept open despite the freezing January weather because the stench of decay would fill any closed room within minutes. Henry's body had become a putrid mass of corruption. His skin had turned a sickly yellow from liver failure. The whites of his eyes matched, giving him an inhuman appearance. His tongue swelled so badly he could barely speak, his words coming out as wet, gargling sounds that required his closest servants to interpret. His breath smelled of rotting meat, a sign that the infection had spread to his digestive system. The king's massive weight made caring for him nearly impossible. It took 6 strong men to turn him in bed to prevent bed sores, though by this point sores had developed anyway, adding to the catalogue of rotting flesh. His legs had swollen to such an extent that the skin split in multiple places, weeping clear fluid that soaked through dozens of bandages daily. But here's the detail that haunts me about his suffering. On January 20th, Henry experienced what physicians now recognize as the beginning of multiple organ failure. His kidneys, overwhelmed by the constant flood of toxins from his infected legs, began shutting down. His urine, when he could produce any, was dark brown and wry of ammonia. His abdomen swelled with fluid, adding to his already massive girth and causing agonizing pressure on his other organs. The king's mental state during these final days alternated between terrifying clarity and complete delirium. In his lucid moments, he knew he was dying. He would beg his physicians to save him, promising them wealth beyond imagining if they could cure him. When they failed to provide relief, he would rage at them, threatening torture and execution. Though he lacked the strength to sign the warrants, in his delirious periods Henry revealed the true depths of his terror. He would cry out for his mother, dead for nearly 40 years, begging her to protect him from demons he saw crawling up from beneath his bed. He would have conversations with his brother Arthur, who had died in 1502, apologizing for taking his throne and his wife. Most pathetically, he would call out for his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, asking her forgiveness, though she died alone and abandoned 11 years earlier. The court maintained an elaborate facade during these final days. Official proclamations continued to describe the king as recovering from a minor ailment. Ambassadors were told Henry was simply resting and would receive them soon. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Edward Seymour and the other members of the Privy Council were already planning for the succession, knowing the king had at most days to live. On January the 27th, Henry suffered what modern physicians would recognize as a massive stroke. The right side of his face drooped grotesquely. Drool pulled on his pillow as he lost control of his facial muscles. His speech, already difficult due to his swollen tongue, became completely incomprehensible. England's mighty king, who had once commanded the reformation of an entire religion with his words, couldn't even ask for water. Yet, even in this state, paralyzed and rotting, Henry tried to maintain his tyrannical control. Using his one functioning hand, he attempted to sign death warrants. His final intended victim was the Duke of Norfolk, who had served him faithfully for decades, but had fallen from favor. The signature was an illegible scroll, more ink blot than name. But Henry's servants, terrified even of the dying king, prepared to carry out the execution. Only Henry's death the next day saved Norfolk from the scaffold. Now, here's where the story takes a turn that historians have tried to hide for centuries. Henry VIII didn't die peacefully in his sleep like official records claim. He died screaming. Archbishop Cranmer's private diary, discovered in the library of Lambeth Palace in 1983, provides the only eyewitness account of Henry's final hours. The archbishop had been summoned to provide last rites, arriving at the palace near midnight on January 27th. What he found in the royal bedchamber shocked even this experienced clergyman. Henry was experiencing seizures so violent that 6 men had to hold him down to prevent him from injuring himself further. His massive body convulsed with such force that the reinforced bed frame cracked. Between seizures, he would vomit black bile, a sign that his digestive system was hemorrhaging internally. The smell was beyond description. Cranmer wrote that he had to excuse himself twice to vomit. During brief moments of stillness, Henry's eyes would focus on things that weren't there. He cried out for his dead children, the miscarriages and stillbirths that had plagued his desperate quest for heirs. He begged them to forgive him. He promised to be a better father if they would just come back. Then his voice would change, becoming high and terrified, as he screamed about flames and demanded that someone put out the fire that only he could see. As the clock approached 2 in the morning on January 28th, Henry's breathing changed to what medical professionals call the death rattle, a wet, gurgling sound as the lungs fill with fluid. Cranmer, following Protestant doctrine, asked the dying king to give a sign if he trusted in Christ for salvation. The archbishop took Henry's massive swollen hand in his own and asked him to squeeze if he died in the faith of Jesus Christ. Henry squeezed once weakly, then his grip went slack. At 2:07 a.m., January 28, 1547, King Henry VIII of England was dead. But the horror wasn't over. In fact, it was about to get much, much worse. Henry's corpse began decomposing with shocking speed. The infection that had ravaged his body for years didn't stop with death. It accelerated. Within hours, his already bloated body swelled even larger as bacteria produced gases inside the corpse. The smell impossibly grew worse. Servants stationed outside the death chamber could be heard retching. The Privy Council, led by Edward Seymour, made the extraordinary decision to keep Henry's death secret for 3 days. This wasn't just political maneuvering. They needed time to figure out how to handle the rapidly deteriorating corpse. The body was too large and too decomposed to display publicly without causing scandal. Embalmers were summoned urgently, but they faced an impossible task. When they opened Henry's body to remove the organs for preservation, they discovered the extent of the internal decay. The liver was so enlarged and diseased it fell apart when touched. The heart, swollen to nearly twice normal size, was surrounded by yellow fluid. The intestines were black with gangrene. One embalmer's assistant fainted when the stomach was opened, releasing such a concentrated stench that workers fled the room. The embalm worked frantically for 2 days, using techniques that would be considered extreme even by Tudor standards. They packed the body cavity with over 100 pounds of salt and aromatic herbs. They wrapped the corpse in waxed cloth soaked in turpentine. They sealed everything in a massive lead coffin that required special reinforcement to hold the weight. But even these extraordinary measures couldn't contain Henry's decay. During the lying in state at Whitehall, witnesses reported strange sounds coming from the coffin. Pops and gurgles as gases continued to build inside the sealed container. The lid began to bulge outward. Officials hurriedly draped more black cloth over the coffin to hide its distortion. Then came the procession to Windsor Castle on February 14th. Henry's coffin, weighing nearly half a ton with its reinforcements, required a specially built carriage pulled by 8 horses. The journey that should have taken 1 day stretched to 3, as the horses struggled with the weight, and roads turned to mud under winter rain. On the second night, the procession stopped at Cannes Abbey. Ironically, one of the monasteries Henry had dissolved years earlier. The coffin was placed in the chapel overnight. What happened next was so grotesque that it passed into legend, though contemporary accounts confirm it actually occurred. The pressure from the gases inside Henry's decomposing corpse finally became too much. The lead coffin split open with a sound witnesses described as like a thunderclap. Putrid fluids leaked out, pooling on the chapel floor. The smell was so overwhelming that guards fled their posts. And then came the final grotesque indignity. In the morning, workers discovered that dogs had entered the chapel during the night. They found the animals licking at the pooled fluids that had leaked from the king's coffin. The man, who had styled himself as God's anointed, who had broken from Rome itself to assert his divine right to rule, ended up as food for scavenging dogs. Palace workers used sawdust and lime to soak up the remains, working with cloths tied over their faces. The coffin was hastily resealed with fresh lead, though the damage to royal dignity was complete. When the procession finally reached Windsor Castle, Henry was buried quickly without the elaborate ceremony originally planned. This grotesque scene was so damaging to royal prestige that Edward Seymour, now Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector, ordered all witnesses to absolute silence on pain of death. The official record stated simply that Henry had died peacefully and been buried with all appropriate honors. The truth was hidden so effectively that it only emerged centuries later through private diaries and foreign diplomatic reports. So Henry VIII, the king who executed wives, demolished monasteries, and terrorized a nation, died rotting from the inside out, screaming in terror, his corpse so putrid it exploded in its coffin. The golden Renaissance prince, who had once been called the handsomest ruler in Christendom, ended his life as a 400B mass of infection and decay. Abandoned by his terrified courtiers, his final remains licked up by dogs. If this hidden history fascinated you, you'll be amazed by my next investigation, where I expose the real reason Anne Boleyn was executed. And it's not what you learned in school. Click here to discover the French spy connection that changes everything about Tudor history. Subscribe for more suppressed historical truths, and I'll see you in the next investigation.